All right. Welcome to the Beltline Church of Christ. We are so glad that you are here. I hate to break up the fellowship, but we need to get into business today. If you have your Bibles, open with me to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4. We talked last week in our study that we've entitled The Coronation of the King, looking at Jesus' life through the Gospel of Mark. We talked about how Jesus was the Lord of the Sabbath and that how he was rest. He wasn't just pointing us to rest, he was rest himself. We talked about how Jesus came not just to reform religion, but to kill it, to do away with it, and replace it with himself. And if you look back to chapter 3 for just a second, one of the things that you see is that as Jesus gains popularity with the people, something else happens as well. As he gains popularity with the people, he loses favor with those religious people, with those religious leaders, with those scribes and Pharisees and others like them. And I want to say this as we get started this morning, and I need you to know that as you begin to draw closer to Jesus, as you begin to pattern your life after him, as you begin to act like he acted and live like he lived, I need you to know that people are going to be drawn to you. But just like with Jesus, those religious leaders, those religious folks, those people that don't know the difference between gospel and advice are going to look at you in a completely different way. They are going to go in the opposite direction of you. It's just the way it works. But stay the course, because we are called to act, and mimic in every possible way our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. As Mark chapter 4 opens, Mark reveals to us some of Jesus' teaching. 4 parables are given to us, and those parables are followed by 4 amazing miracle stories. And there is a progression in these miracle stories from the serious of the situations from which Jesus rescues people. In the first story, which we're going to look at this morning, Jesus calms a storm on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are afraid. They are afraid that they're going to die. The next story, there is a man in Gerasa who lives among the dead and kind of like a living death. The miracle story after that is about a bleeding woman who has been experiencing her life draining out of her for more than 12 years. And finally, we see at the end of these 4 miracles, Jairus' daughter, and we'll talk about her next time. Jairus' daughter is actually dead, and Jesus raises her back to life. And so there's a progression here that happens in these miracle stories. And Mark is making the point that through Jesus, God's power overcomes every possible threat to life and to wholeness, even the ultimate threat that all of us face of death. And another thing he's showing us through these miracle stories, because they happen all over the place. They happen with males and females and Gentiles and Jews and all kinds of different things. He's trying to show us that wholeness is extended to everyone. Men, women, Jew, Gentile, the pure, the polluted, all of them are a part of what God is trying to do. No place, there is no condition beyond the reach of God's saving power. And each part of the story Mark tells reveals to us just a little bit more about who Jesus is, his power, his purpose, and his self-understanding. Mark is revealing Jesus to us gradually like an expert storyteller, but he's also a faithful reporter. And one of the things I want to point out to you as we walk through this study is these little details that Mark gives us, especially in the next section. These things may seem insignificant to us, and they may seem like, well, that doesn't do anything to add any kind of purpose or advance the plot of the story at all. But what these little details show us is a genuine reminiscence that Mark was not an eyewitness, but he was giving us Peter's first-hand reporting. And we can certainly see that in this next story in Mark chapter 4 and verse 35. So let's read together how Jesus calms the storm on the Sea of Galilee in Mark chapter 4, verse 35. Here's what the text says to us. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Now, let me give you some details here. The Sea of Galilee sits 700 feet below sea level. And just 30 miles to the north is Mount Hermon that reaches a height of 9,200 feet high. And so the cold air from the mountain continually clashes with the warm air coming up from the Sea of Galilee. And as a result, there are incredible storms that happen all around here. Thunderstorms, squalls. And when I think about this story, I have a new context in which I view it. I don't know if any of you have seen the video of the duck boat tragedy in Missouri. That's what I think of now when I read this story. I don't know if you saw it. 5 minutes earlier, it's calm as glass. 5 minutes later, this storm has engulfed and killed 17 people. That's what these seasoned fishermen are dealing with, a storm that comes out of nowhere. And you need to know that these are professional fishermen from Galilee. They were used to storms like this. But this storm must have been an incredible one, because these experienced sailors, though they were, thought they were going to die. And they cry out to Jesus, "Don't you care?" I want you to care. Listen to what happens next. Verse 39, Mark chapter 4. "And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, 'Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with great fear." They were terrified, some versions say. "And they said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" And so Jesus wakes up out of this sleep that he is in, and two amazing things happen. The first were Jesus' words themselves. He simply gives a command. He doesn't brace himself. He doesn't roll up his sleeves. He simply says, "Quiet! Be still." He says that to a hurricane. Jesus basically says to this storm, "Knock it off." Just as you would talk to an unruly child. "Knock it off," he says to the storm. And the second most astonishing thing is that the storm obeys him. Like a compliant child, it says, "Okay, we're done," and boom, instant calm. We're talking about a dead calm. Now, if the wind stopped after Jesus' rebuke, that could have been a coincidence. But if you've ever gone on an ocean cruise or lived near the shore, you know that even when the storm stops, the wind stops, and the storm ends, the waves keep pounding the beach for hours and hours and hours. Yet, when Jesus says, "Knock it off," not only do the winds die down, but there is instant calm. Now, the question is, why is that so important? Why does Mark give us that detail? Remember who Mark is writing to, not just Jews, but also to Gentiles. He's writing to people who are following Jesus Christ, and because they are following Jesus Christ, they find themselves in the midst of an amazing storm. They find themselves in absolute danger, and Mark wants them to know that the one that they are following has the power to rescue them. And I want you to know that today as well. He has the power to rescue. You see, one thing the ancient cultures had in common was the belief that the sea was uncontrollable except by God. In ancient cultures and legend, the sea was a symbol of unstoppable destruction. And the sea actually came to symbolize the dark power of evil that was threatening God's creation, God's people, and God's purposes. In fact, in the 11th century, we have a story of a king named Canute, or Canute, I don't know which one. He was a Danish king, and people were saying he was so amazing, and they were flattering him over and over and over. And he said, "Stop it, I'm not divine." And in fact, to prove that he wasn't, he walked down to the shore and said, "Stop," to the waves. And the waves just kept coming and coming and coming. It was his way of saying, only God can stop the sea, and I can't do that, so I'm not God. Jesus, however, Mark is showing us Jesus' power to be able to do that, to exercise power that only God has. And remember, Jesus doesn't say, in the name of God, I command you waves to stop. In the name of this or in the name of that. No, he says, knock it off. And they do. You know, this boat was filling up with water. And I wonder, as the storm is stopped and their boat is full of water, did the water go away when he stilled the storm? I don't know. Or with every bucket that they threw into this calm water, were they even more amazed at the power of Jesus? Who could this be? That even the winds and the waves obey him. Earlier, when Jesus was with the Pharisees on the Sabbath, he said, I'm not just someone who can instruct you to take a rest. He said, I am rest. And now by his actions, Jesus is demonstrating, I'm not just someone who has power, I am power itself. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago from Daniel chapter 7. I want to point back there again. Remember, we talked about the Son of Man and what that meant and the messianic reference that Daniel was talking about. And in Daniel 7, as you open that book, there you will find that there are these monsters that are coming up out of the sea, and they're wreaking havoc until, in verse 13, one like the Son of Man puts them to flight. You see, Mark is saying to anyone who has ears to hear and eyes to see, anyone who will listen, that Jesus is God's agent in defeating the forces of chaos. And that leads me to the first thing I want you to see in this today, and it's this. Jesus is saying to us that anyone and anything in the whole universe that has any power whatsoever has that power on loan from him. He has that power on loan from God. And that is a mighty, mighty claim. To them, that was an outrageous claim. Not to say I have power, but to claim to be power. And anyone who has it, it's because I've given it to him. Isn't that exactly what he says to Pilate many, many, many years later, or a couple years later in our story? You'd have no power at all unless it was given to you by my Father, right? Same idea, same concept. And if this is true, if what I just put on the screen up here is true, and Jesus is who he says he is, then what does that mean for us? Well, there are actually two options. There are two options. Number one, you can argue that this world, you can believe that Jesus isn't who he claimed to be, and you can say that this world is a cosmic accident. And when you die, you'll just return to the dust of the ground. And when the sun goes out, there won't be anyone around to remember anything that you've done. So in the end, whether you are a cruel person or a loving person, it makes no lasting difference whatsoever. That's one option you have when we're thinking about the claims of Jesus Christ. But the second option is this. If Jesus is who he says he is, then there is a completely different way for you and I to look at life. If he is the Lord of the storm, then no matter what shape the world is in, no matter what shape your life is in, are you hearing me this morning? No matter what shape your life is in, you will find Jesus provides all the healing, all the rest, and all the power you could possibly want. And again, how important would that have been to these first century followers of Jesus in the midst of their own storm simply because they believed and followed Jesus Christ? How important would it have been? One of the things that's amazing to me about this story as we look back through it is in verse 38, we see that the disciples are terrified of this storm. But after Jesus calms the storm, they're even more terrified. Isn't that interesting? Before Jesus calms the storm, the disciples are afraid, but after he calms the storm, they're absolutely out of their mind terrified. Why? Because before Jesus was awakened, the boat was nearly swamped and the disciples couldn't bail fast enough. They knew the boat was just seconds from being totally filled or they would die. They woke Jesus up and said, "Don't you care?" You ever said that? Going through your own storm in your life, you ever said to Jesus, "Don't you care?" Where are you in the middle of all of this? I think this is a picture of us. It's a picture of our hearts. I think everyone who's tried to live a life of faith in this world has felt something like this before. When everything's going wrong and you feel like you're sinking and God seems to be nowhere to be found, absent, unaware, or asleep. And maybe your thought is, man, God, if you loved us, this wouldn't be happening to us. That's what the disciples are saying. If you loved us, Jesus, you wouldn't let us go through this. If you loved us, we wouldn't be able to sink and we wouldn't be about to sink. If you loved us, you wouldn't make us endure this. And Jesus calms the storm and he responds to his disciples. But did you see what he said? Did you see what he said to them? He doesn't say, listen, I understand how you feel, and I know you're afraid, but everything's going to be okay. Is that what Jesus says? No. Instead, he says, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Can you imagine what these disciples must have been thinking? You literally thought not 5 seconds earlier your life was about to be over. You've done everything in your power to try to right the ship yourself, right? Imagine what it must have been like. What are you afraid of? Jesus, are we in the same boats? Because look, we're about to drown here. We're afraid you didn't love us because if you did, you wouldn't let these things happen to us. And Jesus shows that that way of thinking that you and I have and that his disciples have is absolutely wrong. In fact, Jesus is saying to us, you should have known better. You should have known better. Jesus is saying, listen, I allow people that I love to go through storms. But here's the truth I need you to get from this. Even in the storms, you have no reason to panic. You have no reason to panic. And if they had little reason to panic during the storm, they certainly had no reason to panic after it died down. But Mark tells us that they were terrified. Why were they more terrified in the calm than they were in the storm? And that's the second thing I want you to get today, and it's this. They were terrified because Jesus was even more unmanageable than the storm was. And we're people who like control. Can I get a weary oh yeah from you? And Jesus says, I will not be controlled. There's nothing you can do to manage me. The storm has immense power. They couldn't control it. And Jesus, who can control the storm, has infinitely more power than that. And so they recognize they have even less control over him. And they are terrified. But there's a huge difference between Jesus and the storm, between Jesus and nature. A storm doesn't love you. A storm doesn't love you. Nature is going to wear you down. Nature is going to destroy you. If you live a long time, eventually your body will give out and die. And maybe it will happen sooner through some kind of tragedy or disaster. Nature is violent and it is overwhelming, and it's going to get you sooner or later. Latest USA Today poll is out. 1 out of 1 die. And you may say, well, Steve, that's true, but if I go to Jesus, I can't control him either. He's not under my control either. He lets things happen to me that I don't understand. He doesn't do things according to my plan. He does things in a way that don't make sense to me. And you'd be right. But if Jesus is God, then he's got to, listen to me. If Jesus is God, then he's got to be great enough to have some reason to let you go through things you can't understand. His power is unbounded, but so is his wisdom, and so is his love. Nature is indifferent to you, but Jesus is filled with an untamable love for you. And if the disciples had really known that Jesus loved them, if they had really understood that he is both powerful and loving, and they wouldn't have woke him up and said, don't you care? This premise that if Jesus loved them, he wouldn't let bad things happen to them is crazy. We've got to stop thinking that. We've got to throw that deceitful lie out. We've got to get rid of that. Jesus can love somebody and still let bad things happen to him because he is God and because he knows better than we do. And that may not give you comfort in the middle of the storm that you're facing right now. But if that doesn't, then remember that a storm doesn't love you, but he does. And he will never, ever, ever quit loving you. And if you have a God great enough and powerful enough to be mad at because he doesn't stop your suffering, then you also have a God who's great enough to have reasons beyond what you can understand for what you're going through. You can't have it both ways. I love what Elizabeth Elliot, not the 4-year-old sitting in front of me, said. Or is she 3? I don't remember. 3 or she's 4. I got it right. Good. This is what she said. God is God, and since he is God, he is worthy of my worship, and he's worthy of my service. And I will find rest nowhere else but in his will. And that will is necessarily, infinitely, immeasurably, unspeakably beyond my largest notions of what he's up to. So, here's the third thing I need you to get today. God is not always safe, but he is always good. And if you've come to church today looking for safety, I'm here to tell you you're in the wrong place. Oh, you can find safety. You can go through the motions and have a safe, nice little life, but that's not the life God calls us to. He doesn't call us to a safe life. He calls us to a life of impact, a life where storms are going to come and storms are going to leave, when we're going to have mountaintop highs and valley lows, and we're going to live in the middle and try to work this whole thing out. But the bottom line is, he is good, and he is with us, and he is for us. And so Jesus asked them, do you still have no faith? And by asking it this way, Jesus wants to know, this is so important. By asking them, do you still have no faith? Jesus is wanting to know if they have faith in faith, or if they have faith in the object of that faith. Do you understand the difference today? And I'm convinced that this is one of the major problems that we have in Christianity today. That we have a lot of faith in faith, but not as much faith in the God who stands behind that. Let me try to illustrate it this way. Imagine you're falling off a cliff. There's a great imagination right there. And sticking out of the cliff is a branch that is strong enough to hold you, but you don't know that when you're falling. You don't know how strong the branch is. And as you fall, you have just enough time to grab that branch. So, my question is, how much faith do you have to have in the branch for it to save you? Do you have to be totally sure that it can save you before you can grab it? Of course not. You only have to have enough faith to grab the branch. I'm going to say something amazingly profound to you right now. Now, I wish this originated with me, but it didn't, so here it is. It's not the quality of your faith that saves you. It's not the quality of your faith that saves you. It's the object of your faith that saves you. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't have a quality faith? Of course not. But let's not put these things backwards. It is not the quality. It's not how much you have known and how much you understand, how much you've grasped, how much you've memorized, how much you've quoted, how much you've done this. That's not what saves you. He does. He does. It doesn't matter how you feel about the branch. All that matters is the branch. And Jesus is the branch. Here's what that means. If you're here today and you want to believe, but for some reason you just can't get there. You want to revive your faith. You want to get back that fire or passion that you had at the beginning, or you want to start your walk with God to begin with. If you want to believe but you can't, here's what I'm going to say to you. Stop looking inside of yourself. Go to Jesus and say, I need help. Help me believe. Go to him and say, God, I know you are the one who gives faith, and I've been trying to work it out by reasoning and thinking and meditating and going to church. I've been hoping that some sermon would move me. I've been trying to get faith by myself, but now I see that you're the source of faith. You're the source of power, and so I need you to increase my faith. Do you believe that that's a prayer that lines up with the will of God for you? Then why wouldn't Jesus answer it? Why wouldn't he answer it? And if you do that, what you'll find, if you pray, increase my faith, you'll find that Jesus has been right there all along. Acts 17 says he's not far from each of us, and he's saying, I've been waiting for you to ask me that instead of trying to do it by yourself. I've been waiting. I've been waiting. I just want that to sit there for a second. It's not the object. It's not the quality of your faith. It's him. It's always been him. It will always be him. I want you to notice something else. Mark deliberately has laid out this account for us of Jesus calming the storm using language that is parallel, almost identical to the language of the famous Old Testament account of Jonah. Did you catch that as you were reading this story this week? He's deliberately laid out the language so that it's parallel to the account of Jonah in the Old Testament. Think about it. Both Jesus and Jonah were in the boat. Both boats were overtaken by a storm. In fact, the description of the storm in Jonah and the description of the storm here in Mark chapter 4 are almost identical. Both Jesus and Jonah are asleep when the storm happens. And in both stories, the sailors wake up the sleeper and say, "What are you doing?" Both of them say, "We're going to die." And in both cases, there was divine intervention and the sea was calmed. Not only that, but in both stories, the sailors became even more terrified than they were before the storm was calmed. Both stories. So what is Mark up to? Two identical stories with one major difference. Jonah said to the sailors, in effect, there's only one thing to do. If I perish, you survive. If I die, you will live. And he said, throw me into the sea, and they did. And they threw him into the ocean, and the storm stopped. And that doesn't happen in our story. Or does it? I think Mark is showing us that these stories aren't actually different when you stand back a bit and look at them with the rest of the story of Jesus in view. Do you remember what Matthew says to us? One greater than Jonah is here. Jesus says those words and he's referring to himself. He says, I am the true Jonah. And here's what he meant. Someday I'm going to calm all storms. I'm going to still all waves. I'm going to destroy destruction. I'm going to break brokenness. And I am going to kill death. How can he do that? He can do it only because when he was on the cross, he was thrown willingly, just like Jonah, into the ultimate storm that can actually sink us, the storm of eternal justice, of what we owe for our wrongdoing. And that storm wasn't calmed, not until it swept Jesus away. And so here's the last thing I need you to get today. If this picture, if the sight of Jesus bowing his head into that ultimate storm on the cross of Calvary, if that picture is burned into the core of your being, you will never say, God, don't you care? God, don't you care? And listen, if you know that he didn't abandon you in the ultimate storm, he could have called 10,000 angels. He could have wrecked shop right there and taken everything off and done something. If he didn't abandon you in the ultimate storm, what makes you think he'll abandon you in the much smaller storms that you're experiencing right now? You know, when you read a good book, you often only see the point of earlier bits of information when you get to the later parts of the story, right? Anyone who already knew Mark's story like we do might read this paragraph and see in it, like someone looking the wrong way through a pair of binoculars, a tiny version of the whole thing. But here is Jesus with his disciples. He's going about his business. And here are the forces of evil, people plotting his death, people trying to get rid of him. And Jesus is there, not asleep on a pillow, but slumped on a cross. He's cried out, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." He's cried out, "It is finished," and there is his lifeless body on the cross. And we hear his voice, "Why are you still afraid? Don't you believe?" And on the third day, the storm was still, and the tomb is empty, and a great fear comes upon them all. Who is this? And the answer comes from an unlikely place. The answer comes from a Roman centurion who has seen the whole thing, who's witnessed all of it. You remember what he says? Truly, this was the Son of God. And someday, of course, he's going to return and he's going to still all storms for all eternity. And if you let that penetrate to the very center of your being, you will know that he loves you, you will know that he cares, and then you will have the power to handle anything in life that is thrown at you from all kinds of different sources and places, but you'll be able to handle it all. If that image of God is burned into the core of who you are, you'll be able to handle them with poise and power and grace and mercy, because that's who the Son of God is, and that's who he invites us to be. I know some of you today are battling your own storms, and the winds are terrible, and the boat's filling up, and you're bailing. You're doing everything you can to get the water out, and you're trying to do this by yourself. I just want you to wake Jesus up. And you do that by committing your life to him, by saying, God, I can't beat this by myself. I need you. And just like he came to the aid and rescue of these disciples, he will come to your aid. It may not be in the way that you think, but he will always come to your defense, because he is for you, not against you. And he has promised he will never leave us nor forsake us. And so if you're in the middle of one of those storms today and you want us to pray for you, we want to do that. We hope that you'll take advantage of this opportunity right now. There's places down for you to come and let us know so that we can pray for you. If you've never given your life to Jesus, I pray today will be the day that you give your life to the Son of God, the one who is power, the one who is rest, and the one who invites you to it. Come, believing, repenting, confessing, getting to the waters of baptism where he removes our sins and gives us grace and mercy to walk this thing called life. Whatever your need may be today, we stand ready to help you. There's no power in us. We get our power from the one who is power, and that's Jesus. So come to him today, right now, while we stand and sing this song for your encouragement.